How much cash do you actually need in your emergency savings account? You know, most Americans don't even have $500 saved up, so in general, asking people to save more money is a good idea. But one of the typical pieces of advice that I hear all the time is how large of an emergency savings account you need. It's sort of given as a one-size-fits-all answer without much in the way of guidance or advice on how they actually got to that number. So today, I want to talk about how big your emergency account needs to be and why I only have 60 to 90 days of cash on hand and why that works great for me. So let's talk about cash. What is it? Well, when I talk about cash, what I'm thinking about is the stuff that's in your checkings, your savings account, or the money market funds in your brokerage account. And those typically have some insurance against theft, and they have some interest. The interest is usually pretty low. It's somewhere between 0.1% to 0.5%. And that's actually how banks and brokerages make a ton of money off of you. They take the cash that you have in your cash account and loan it out to other people for a much higher rate. So it's really sad when you have your cash sitting there and you're not making as much money as you possibly could. And think about why it's important. The more cash you have seems like it'd be good. But the problem is that the interest that you get on your cash doesn't keep up with the rising costs. You see, every year costs go up by a little bit, and the money that you get on your savings account or your cash that you have doesn't keep up with those rising costs. Take, for example, if you invested in 2018 $10,000. If you put that $10,000 into a bank account, you'd probably have $10,150 left right now, which wouldn't be that much. But if you took that same $10,000 and you put it in a Vanguard Total Stock Market Fund, you'd have over $13,500. And that includes 1 year, 2018, which was a down year. You actually would have lost money. So if you take your cash and you invest it and you put it to work, you'll start to grow your investment will start to grow much faster, and you'll start to end up with more money. When the more cash you have, then you've lost that potential for those earnings because you're keeping it off to the side. And that's why how much cash you actually need is something that's important to consider. So now's a great time to hit the like button if you like this video. It'll help the YouTube algorithm show you more videos like this one, and also it'll help me out. This is my very first video, so a like button will do a lot to help me. Okay, so the typical advice that you get is you need 6 months of cash on hand. And that makes sense when you're starting out and you don't have a lot of investments. Because if the market were to crash and you were to lose your job, you need some money to live off of. And not only would you have to sell your investments after a market downturn for much less, now that the market's dropped down, when you have to sell those investments, they may not even be enough for you to live off of until you can find your next job. So that 6 months of cash on hand in the beginning makes a lot of sense. But later on, as your investments grow, that logic starts to break down. I think the first thing is, if you had enough money saved up and you retired, you wouldn't have a job. So there wouldn't be any new income coming in from a job, and so you wouldn't be looking for a job. I think the second thing is really understanding, how important it is to put as much money to work as possible. In other words, if you set aside a large pile of cash, it's not going to grow. It's not going to keep up with rising costs. But if you take as much of that cash as you can and invest it, it's going to grow and you're going to make more from your money. If you think about the 4% rule, which is actually now the 5% rule, it says that the very first year you retire, you can take 4% of your investments and live off of it. And then every year after that, you can grow the money that you take out of your investments by the rate that inflation goes up. So in that 4%, now 5% rule, you're taking that money out and it's growing and growing every year, regardless of whether the market goes up or the market goes down. And this actually works because the money that you're making off your investments is rises much faster and grows much quicker than inflation, than costs go up. So you can actually make up for any deficits you might have when you pull a bunch of money out when the market goes down in a down year. To recap, having 6 months of cash on hand in the beginning makes a lot of sense. But then having cash on hand later on when you retire and have a lot of investments doesn't make much sense at all. So how do you go from having 6 months to almost nothing in cash, and then what does almost nothing mean? How should you think about that? Well, first, let's talk about that lower limit. Like, what's the minimum that you actually need and why? So you can actually think of a real example that happened just last year in March of 2020, the market meltdown. The markets crashed, all the prices dropped, but something more interesting happened, and that is there wasn't any liquidity. There were no buyers for the stuff that people had to sell. If somebody was willing to buy it, it would probably be at a fire sale, really low price. But really the market wasn't functioning at all. Buyers and sellers weren't being matched up at all. It wasn't until the Federal Reserve came in and said, we're going to lower interest rates a lot to almost zero, and we're going to dump a whole bunch of cash in the economy and start actually buying treasuries and maybe even mortgage-backed securities. It's when the Fed made that announcement that the market started to function a lot more normally. Now, a normal function market doesn't mean you like the prices. The prices were still pretty depressed. But hey, at least buyers and sellers were being matched up at that point. It's those moments where the market doesn't have those liquidity and everything's frozen up and you can't find a buyer for your stuff. That's when you really need cash. And in March of 2020, that period lasted for 19 days. I think that's a pretty decent amount of time, that 10 to 20 days. But I always feel better if I have, like 2 months, like 60 or even 90 days of cash on hand. So that if there was some liquidity event or the markets froze up, I'd have more than enough to ride that out. And I think that's why that 60 to 90 days is the absolute minimum. It's the smallest you should go. The 60 to 90 days being the cash you actually need to support your living expenses. Having that 60 to 90 days cash is great when the market freezes up, but it's not enough to cover you if the market has a downturn and a big drop. In that case where you lose your job and you lose your job and the market drops, you really need some money to help you out while you go and look for a new job. But now the question is, how much do you need? If it's more than 60 or 90 days, we know it's somewhere up to 6 months. But how do you figure out how much that should be? And that's where we go back to that 5% rule. We take a look at our investments. So if we have a lot of investments, we need almost no additional cash because those investments will be more than enough to help us out and provide our living expenses. And as time goes on, right, they're going to grow much faster than inflation, and it's going to sort of fill back up our investment tank. So think of it this way. For every $100,000 of non-retirement investments you have, you can take $5,000 off of your emergency cash account. Why $5,000? Because 100,000 times 5% equals $5,000. And so as you get $200,000 in non-retirement investments, you can take your emergency cash savings down by $10,000. And you can keep going like that until you get to that minimum lower level, that 60 to 90 days of cash on hand. It may help to have an example. Let's say you look at your living expenses and you say, man, for 6 months, the absolute bare minimum that I need is $20,000. So that's the size of my emergency account. Then you go look at all the investments you have, take out your non-retirement investments, and you say, oh, I have $300,000 of non-retirement investments. So $300,000 times 5%, that 5% rule, gets you $15,000. So $15,000 minus $20,000 gets you to $5,000. You're like, wow, maybe I can go down to $5,000. But then you think about it and you're like, but how much do I actually need? What's the bare minimum? Is $5,000 enough, right? And that's a quarter, right, of your $20,000. You're like, that would be enough for about 3 months. Yeah, that sounds about right. So that $5,000 emergency cash would be enough to support me for 3 months. And all these non-retirement investments that I have, I'll be able to tap into them, in case something does happen. Now, the reason I say non-retirement accounts is solely because pulling money out of retirement accounts before you're actually retired is super confusing, and you could be exposed to a penalty, and that's no fun. The rules about when you can take money out are complicated. There are times that you can take money out of your IRA and pay for things like health insurance when you're not employed, but it's a complex set of rules and they seem to keep changing. And so maybe I'll cover that in another video. But the reason I take those non-retirement accounts and leave them off, take the retirement accounts and put them off to the side, is because it's so confusing about what the rules are and when you can pull money out of them. So I hope you're able to take this advice and maybe put some more cash to work so you can grow your money even faster. Bye-bye.